She arrived with a baby no one believed belonged to her. But what Annie brought to Elkhorn Ridge was not a liette, was a warning. Before we dive in, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and hit the subscribe button. The stagecoach creaked to a halt under the brittle hush of snow falling on Elkhorn Ridge, its wooden wheels locking in frozen mud as 6 figures emerged to meet it, but it was the 7th who drew every eye. She stepped down in white, not bridal satin, but a threadbare dress gone pale from years of wash, a baby bundled against her chest, and silence surrounding her like a second skin. Her name was Annie. That was all she gave at first. She didn't smile when the townspeople leaned in to gawk, didn't blink when a woman at the post office muttered, "That baby's too new." He sent for her near 6 months ago. The child whimpered softly, buried deep in wool and warmth, but Annie only tightened her arms and looked up at the man waiting in the shadows near the feed store, Samuel Ward. Elkhorn Ridge knew him as the recluse in the hills, the cripple with coal dust lungs and bones crushed by a mine that swallowed his brother's whole. He hadn't been seen in town since summer. And now here he was, gray-eyed and grim, a wheeled chair beneath him, and a fur-lined coat sagging off narrow shoulders. He said nothing at first, only watched her. She didn't flinch. "Mr. Ward," she said. "I'm Annie." He gestured to the wagon, said something to the driver, then turned his gaze on the baby without speaking. One of the onlookers coughed behind a glove. Another muttered, "Ain't possible." Annie heard them all. Her spine didn't bend. "He's quiet," she said, as if that explained everything. Samuel's voice was gravel. "We leave now." By the time they reached the outer ridge road, snow had begun to fall in earnest, the kind that blanketed sound and erased tracks before they'd settled. Annie sat stiff in the back of the cart, rocking the baby, humming something low and old as the horse strained uphill. Samuel said little. He never looked back. When they reached the cabin, hidden behind a thicket of pine that held the wind like secret, she stepped out first, shifting the child to her hip. "You built it yourself?" she asked. Samuel gave a single nod. Before the mine, she stepped onto the porch. The baby stirred, and for a moment she thought she saw something move between the trees. "We'll be fine here," she said aloud, not just to him. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and stone. Dust lay thick on everything. Annie set the baby on the bed and began to clean. She opened shutters, stirred the hearth, unpacked what little she owned: a tin pot, 2 spoons, the letter from the agency. Samuel stayed near the window, watching snow begin to cover their trail. "The child," he said suddenly, voice like a saw. "He's not mine." Annie's hands stilled. "I know," she said. "I never claimed he was." His eyes flicked toward her, sharp, unreadable. "But you claim I never touched you." "That's true," she said, meeting his gaze. "You didn't." He looked back toward the trees. "Then why bring him here?" Her voice broke before she could stop it. "Because I had nowhere else." That night, the wind screamed like it remembered something. Annie wrapped the baby in thick blankets and rocked him, while Samuel sat unmoving by the window. She did not sleep. Near midnight, the baby's eyes fluttered open, and he looked toward the door, then smiled, not at her, not at Samuel, but at the wood beyond, as if something smiled back. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She only rocked him harder and whispered, "Not yet, not here, not again." Snow smothered the world by morning, thick and cold and unforgiving, and Annie stood barefoot at the cabin window. Her fingers curled tight around the curtain as she watched the white bury the last trace of the wagon's wheels. Samuel hadn't spoken since last night. He sat in his chair near the fire, wrapped in silence like armor, eyes shut but not asleep. The baby lay on a folded quilt beside the hearth, his gaze wide and far too still for a child his age. He didn't fuss. He didn't cry. He simply watched. Annie didn't know what he was looking at, only that it wasn't her. "He didn't used to do that," she whispered, not realizing she'd spoken aloud. Samuel didn't open his eyes. "You talk to ghosts often?" She turned from the window. "No," she said quietly, "just myself and babies." He opened his eyes then, slow and heavy-lidded. "You expect him to answer back?" "Sometimes I think he already has." Samuel grunted, wheeled himself toward the window. It'll be 3 days before it lets up, maybe more. She watched the fire dance in his reflection. I don't mind snow, she said. Snow is honest. It hides nothing for long. He didn't answer, but she caught the flicker in his jaw before he turned away. There's wood out back, if you can get to it. I'll try. She wrapped herself in his old coat, the sleeves too long and heavy, and stepped into the white. Wind bit through the seams and turned her breath to fog, but she moved anyway, boots cracking through crusted layers as she circled the cabin and reached the woodpile. She didn't see it at first. Only when she bent to gather the top logs did she notice the print beside them deep, too wide for a boot, too rounded for a paw, a shape like nothing she knew. Something had been watching. Recently, she didn't scream, just stood, silent, listening. The wind howled once, then stilled. She gathered the logs fast, stacked them in her arms, and hurried back inside. Samuel looked up when she shut the door. You hear something? She shook her head. No, just wind. But her voice was thinner than before. That night, the baby wouldn't sleep. He lay on the quilt, silent still, but his eyes flicked constantly to the door. Annie rocked him, sang softly, every word from memory, lullabies her mother used to hum over weeping nights. Sleep, my love, sleep while you can. The snow will hush the dark-eyed man. But the baby didn't blink, didn't yawn, just stared. Samuel watched from the shadows. You never said his name. She looked up startled. The baby's name, he said. You've never spoken it. She hesitated. I don't say it anymore. Why? Because it isn't mine, she said. Not really. Then whose is it? Her lips trembled. He had a name before he was born. His father gave it to him, whispered it when he thought I was asleep. I didn't want to keep it. I didn't want to keep any of it. But he remembered. Samuel's brow furrowed. You didn't want him? I didn't want the reason he exists. The fire cracked between them. What's his name, Annie? It's Elias, she said finally. It means the Lord is my God. But the man who gave it didn't believe in anything but fists. Samuel said nothing for a long time. You came all this way to bury that past, he said. You should know this place doesn't stay buried, not for long. Then why did you send for a bride? She asked. Why take in a woman and her baby when you wanted no past of your own? His eyes flicked to the window. Because no one else came, and because the mountain remembers everything. That night, she dreamed of footsteps crunching, snow-slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. When she woke, the fire was out. The baby was still. Samuel's eyes were open. I heard it too, he said, before she could speak. Something's out there. She gathered Elias to her chest and backed toward the wall. It's not wolves. No, he said. Wolves don't knock. 3 soft raps came from the door, light as breath. Then silence. She didn't move. Neither did he. Morning came, but the snow kept falling. The footsteps never returned, but the baby's eyes stayed open. The third morning brought no sun, only a deeper hush that sank through the roof, like breath held too long. And when Annie stepped outside to fetch water from the barrel, she saw the print again. Only now it was closer, right beneath the window where the baby slept. She crouched beside it, heart thudding, snow clinging to her sleeves, and this time she saw what hadn't been there before, a sliver of black wedged in the packed ice. She pried it loose, a feather. Thick, iridescent, unnaturally heavy. Raven, maybe, but wrong somehow. Its shaft was carved, notched, as if someone had sharpened it, like a blade. She tucked it into her coat pocket, glancing toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but the silence was watching. Back inside, Samuel had dragged his chair to the table, working something with his hands. Traps broken, he muttered as she stepped in. We'll need meat by tomorrow. She said nothing, only moved to the hearth where Elias lay, too quiet again. His skin felt cool. Not sick, just pulled thin, as if something was feeding on his dreams. I found this. She placed the feather on the table. Samuel stopped. Where? Near the water barrel. He picked it up, turning it slowly, then narrowed his eyes. That's not bird. What do you mean? I mean this, he said, voice low. Ain't meant to fly. He pulled a knife from the drawer and tapped the feather's spine. It rang, metallic, hollow. It's been hollowed and sealed, like a bone flute. A what? Old tribes used them. For calling. Calling what? He looked at the baby, then back at her. Depends who answers. She sat down, arms tight around herself. There was a man once, she whispered. When I was 12. He came to our town, not as a preacher or a trader or anything you'd expect. Just wandered in, black coat, limp in his left leg, carried nothing but a sack of bird bones tied to his belt. They called him the Bone Piper. Said he never spoke a word, just sat near the edge of camp and carved whistles. My mama told me to stay away, but I didn't. Samuel watched her closely. Did he hurt you? No. He gave me a feather, just like this one. Said it would protect me if I ever found the woods listening. She swallowed. But then 3 days later, a boy went missing, and the piper disappeared. Folks said it was a coyote, but I found a trail of feathers leading to the trees. She looked at the baby. When Elias was born, he didn't cry, not until I whispered that old man's name. Then he screamed, like he knew. What name? Samuel asked. Cadric, she said, voice cracking. Cadric of the Hollow. The cabin went still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Samuel leaned back. I've heard that name before, but never from anyone still living. She stared at him. You think he followed me? No, he said. I think he sent for you. That night, the knocking came again. Not at the door this time, but at the walls. Soft scratches, like a bird testing bark. Elias cried. Not wailed cried. A single sound that broke open her ribs. She gathered him up, heart hammering, and felt something slip beneath her hand. Paper. A note she hadn't seen before, tucked into his blanket folds. In spidery dark ink, you should have stayed dead. She staggered back, breath gone, and Samuel reached her in 3 pushes of his wheels. What is it? She held out the paper. He read it once, then tore it clean down the middle and tossed it into the fire. Don't show him fear, he said. He feeds on it. I'm not scared, she lied. I'm furious. But when she lay down that night, cradling Elias, her dreams filled with wings, black wings, and a man with a bone flute between his teeth, smiling with a single raven tooth where his eye should have been. The wind shifted on the 4th night and brought with it a sound Annie had no name for, a long, moaning hush that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite human either, but curled down the chimney and wrapped itself around the cradle-like breath that knew the shape of the child. She sat bolt upright on the cot, her hands immediately seeking Elias, and felt the damp chill against his neck as if someone had touched him moments before. Samuel was awake too. She heard the faint creak of his chair as he rolled toward the fireplace, shovel in hand, eyes sweeping the shadows like they'd moved on their own. It's not outside, he muttered, voice so quiet it barely reached her. It's underneath us now. Annie stared at the floorboards. You said this cabin was built on bedrock. Mostly, except the old root cellar. It was boarded decades ago, never touched it. Why not? Because my father said not to. Said there was something sealed in down there. Something that begged too sweetly to be believed. Annie swallowed hard and hugged Elias closer. I think it's asking again. At dawn, she found the hatch, under the rug near the hearth, 4 nailed planks, warped with age, sealed with pitch, and faint burn marks around the edges. Samuel watched from his chair, jaw clenched, knuckles white against the armrest. You don't have to open it, he said. Then tell me what's down there. He hesitated. My brother. She froze. You never said you had a brother. I don't. Not anymore. His name was Caleb. He was born with the Vela call across his face. They said that meant he could see the other world. My mother said it was a blessing. My father said it was a curse. By 10, Caleb could call animals to him, crows, wolves, even a mountain lion once. By 12, he was hearing things in the forest, whispers, names. He said something lived in the dark beyond the pines, said it liked him. Samuel's voice cracked. Then one night he lit a fire under the house, said it was a signal. My father beat him bloody, locked him down there for the winter. When spring came, the door was still sealed, but Caleb wasn't inside. Just feathers. Dozens of black feathers. And a single bone flute, carved from something that didn't look like any animal we knew. Annie stared at the hatch. You think he's still down there? No, Samuel whispered. I think he got out. I think he became something else. That night, the crying started again, but it wasn't Elias. The baby was silent, eyes wide and unblinking, as if he too heard the echo rising from the floor, muffled and warped, like a memory sobbing through wood. Annie lit every lamp, every candle, but the sound didn't stop. Samuel sat in his chair, unmoving, staring at the hearth as if waiting for something to crawl through the flames. When she could take no more, Annie wrapped Elias tightly and placed him in Samuel's lap. Hold him. Don't move, no matter what you hear. What are you doing? Getting answers. She pried up the boards one by one, her hands shaking, the pitch flaking like dried blood under her fingernails. The smell hit first damp earth and something older, like mold mixed with copper. Then came the cold, rising like a breath from a buried mouth. She lit a lantern, held it out, and stared into the black pit beneath her feet. Stone walls, rotten stairs, and feathers. So many feathers. She stepped down, heart pounding, each creak of the steps echoing like thunder. At the bottom lay a circle of bones, perfectly arranged, each sharpened to a point and facing inward. In the center sat a small cradle, empty, its blanket neatly folded. She stepped closer, lantern shaking in her grip hand. Then the air changed, grew dense, alive. A voice, not quite a whisper, slid up the walls like oil. You took what was mine. Annie froze. I didn't take anything. He was promised. I gave him breath. You're not his father. But I was first. The shadows shifted, formed the shape of a man tall, thin, with eyes that shimmered like obsidian. A raven feather dangled from his neck, and in his hand he held a bone flute slick with something dark. You fled, hid, but he still heard me, still carries me. Annie stepped into the circle of bones. Then I take him back, fully, now, and you get nothing. The figure hissed. Blood seals, blood freeze. She took out the knife from her boot, sliced her palm, and let the blood drip onto the cradle. The bones trembled. The shadows screamed. The figure lunged. And upstairs, Elias Waelda sound that shattered glass and split silence like judgment. Then it was over. The figure vanished. The shadows broke. And Annie crawled back up, bloody and sobbing, into the arms of a baby who now slept as peacefully as if nothing had ever stirred. Samuel's eyes were wet. What did you do? I gave him my name, she said, collapsing beside the hearth, so that thing would never own it again. By morning the wind had fallen dead, and the woods stood silent, too silent, as though the forest had pulled breath from the world and was holding it somewhere just beyond the tree line. Samuel hadn't spoken since the night before, but his eyes tracked every shadow like a man who'd seen war and came home with ghosts for company. Annie cleaned the blood from her palm and wrapped the cut tight, whispering soft prayers over Elias as she nursed him, trying to ignore how the baby's eyes no longer blinked the same way, as if the veil between what he saw and what others saw had thinned. That evening, while boiling water over the stove, Annie stepped outside for a moment to throw the dishwater and caught sight of something that turned her marrow cold. Tracks. Fresh tracks in the snow, leading up to the cabin but none leading away. Bare human feet, toes pressed deep into the ice, but not wide like a man's. Long and narrow. Wrong. She backed inside, bolted the door, and dragged the table over it, her breath fogging in the cold, as Samuel turned slowly toward her. What did you see? Nothing, she said, not lying, because whatever it was had left no name behind. That night she didn't sleep, nor did the baby. Elias whimpered and kicked and growled low in his throat, not like a child, but like an animal dreaming of teeth. She held him tighter, whispering lullabies from her girlhood back east, songs about sunlight and rivers and linen sheets drying in spring air, the kind of life she had before the train, before her mother's eyes looked away when the sheriff asked who the father was, before she was handed a one-way ticket and told to start again where the snow made lies easier to bury. Samuel sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, every stroke dragging across the whetstone with slow, rhythmic finality. "You want to tell me now?" he said without looking up. "What you ran from?" Annie stiffened. "Does it matter?" "It does if it followed you here." She met his gaze and something in her cracked open. There was a man, a preacher, or that's what he said he was. He came to town with a revival, said God spoke to him in visions. But it wasn't God. He had a book made of hide, real hide, human, I think. And when he touched my belly and said the child inside was chosen, my mother said I was cursed. Samuel's knife paused. The preacher, what happened to him? He vanished the night the fire took the church. But he told me, if I didn't bring the child west, if I didn't hide him where the snow spoke in silence, he'd come back for both of us. He said the land remembers. And that something waits here, something that would protect the boy until the day came to awaken what sleeps in his blood. Samuel rubbed his eyes. So this wasn't just a flight, it was an offering. No, she said fiercely. I didn't bring him here to be taken. I brought him here to be free. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it blew from the east now, carrying not cold, but scent burnt cedar and old blood. Samuel's head turned slowly. He's near. The preacher? No, something older. I saw it once, when I was trapped in the mine, after the collapse. Men said I was under 4 days, but I swear to you, Annie, time didn't pass the same down there. I heard drums in the earth, heard chanting in no language men speak. And something crawled through the seams of rock, not touching but knowing. It told me things, showed me how to listen when the world tries to lie. That's how I knew when you came. You weren't running from something ordinary. She wrapped Elias tighter and rose from the bed, moving to the window. Snow had started falling again, but light more like ash than flake sand. In the clearing she saw him, a man in black robes, head bowed, standing still as a gravestone in the middle of their woodpile. He's here. Samuel reached for the rifle. Then let's meet him proper. No, Annie whispered. That's what he wants. Fear. Invitation. We don't open that door. Then what do? We wait until he breaks the rule. What rule? He can't enter unless blood touches the sill. Samuel looked to the floorboards. Yours? Or Elias's? She stood straighter. But he won't get either. Hours passed. The man outside didn't move. Snow fell harder. The baby quieted, as though sensing a storm that required stillness. Then, just before dawn, a knock. Gentle, 3 times, and a whisper on the wind, smooth as honey and sharp as glass. You cannot keep what does not belong to you. Annie stepped forward, placed her bleeding palm against the inside of the door, and hissed through clenched teeth. Then come claim it and see how the mountain buries thieves. But there was no reply, no sound at all, just silence, and when they looked out again, the man was gone, but the tracks were not. And they didn't fade. They led right up to the window and stopped. By morning, the light had a yellow cast, the kind that filtered through snow, not falling, but suspended in the air like breath that hadn't yet chosen where to land. Annie lit the lantern with trembling fingers, careful not to wake Elias from the strange half-sleep he'd drifted into. His lids fluttered, but his body was still, his little fists unclenched beside her, as if even he had begun to understand there were worse things than cold in these woods. Samuel moved through the cabin like a shadow, barely making a sound as he loaded shells into the rifle, one after the other, each click a quiet defiance against whatever had come whispering outside their walls. You didn't dream it, he said at last, as if confirming something to himself. I saw him too. Annie didn't answer. Her eyes were on the frost at the window, which hadn't melted despite the stove burning all night. He was standing where the old deer used to graze, she murmured. I recognized the tree he stood under. Only that tree's gone now. Fell last spring in a storm. Samuel paused. So what did he stand under then? They both looked toward the woods, and neither said the word that hung heavy in the room, nothing. That night the howling began out wolves, but something higher pitched, warbling like a child humming through torn lips. It circled the cabin, then footsteps overhead, not across the snow. Across the roof, Annie froze, hand clutching Elias close as her gaze went upward. Samuel held his breath. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging a heavy boot or something with weight, but not quite human rhythm. Then, silence. Hours passed without sleep. By dawn, Annie found blood on the window, latcher blood, from the wound on her palm, though she hadn't touched the window. "He needs something," she whispered. "What?" Samuel asked. "Permission. Surrender. A name, maybe." She stared down at Elias, who stared back wide-eyed and blinking too slow. "The babies never cried like this before we came here. Never looked like this. He was sweet, quiet, just a child. Maybe he still is. Then why does he hum in his sleep? Why do the trees bend toward this cabin when the wind is still?" Samuel said nothing. Instead, he took a piece of charcoal and began drawing symbols on the cabin walls. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "In the mine," he said. "I saw them in the dark. I remembered." He finished a circle with a jagged break through the center. "This one stops them from listening." "Who's them?" "The ones that wait." That night Annie woke to Elias, not breathing. She sat up, heart hammering, and placed her ear to his chest butt. There was nothing. No sound. No pulse. She screamed for Samuel, but before he could reach her, Elias opened his mouth and let out a wail so piercing the glass cracked in the window. The oil lamp burst, the fire roared, and the symbols Samuel had drawn turned black and began to smolder. "Take him outside," Samuel shouted, covering his ears. "It's the cabin, they're in the walls." She wrapped Elias in a blanket and stumbled through the smoke, kicking open the door into the freezing air, collapsing in the snow. The baby stopped crying the instant they hit the cold. His eyes closed peacefully. The wind died, and the forest fell still. She looked behind her. Samuel knelt inside the doorway, watching her with something between awe and dread. "You remember what you said," he called. "That he wasn't touched, that no man fathered him." Annie nodded, teeth chattering. "Then what did?" She swallowed, staring down at Elias. "I don't know, but I think it followed me here." "No," Samuel said. "I think it was already here. I think you just brought the key." Behind them, the cabin groaned. Not from wind. From inside. As if something in the floorboards was shifting, rising. Samuel grabbed a shovel and moved toward the hearth. "Help me," he said. "We need to dig. Inside? It's not wood beneath us. Not just wood. Look." He pried up the first board and revealed not dirt but stone. Carved stone, covered in spiral glyphs, and sunken wells, like cups. "This was never a cabin," he muttered. "It was a cover." Annie stared at it. "A temple." "No," he said, lowering his voice. "An altar." That night, as the snow returned, they lay Elias between them and took turns watching the window. No more footsteps came, no more voices. But at some point near dawn, the baby opened his eyes and spoke one word. Him. And Annie knew then she had made a terrible mistake. Not by coming west, but by believing this place would let her leave once it had remembered who she was. The logs burned low, casting a coppery glow against the stone beneath the hearth, and Samuel hadn't spoken in hours, not since Elias said that word. Him. It hung between them like smoke that didn't rise. Annie rocked the child in her arms, but he didn't need soothing. His breath came calm, too calm for a baby. His eyes opened too wide for sleep, watching the ceiling like he saw stars through the wood. Samuel had unearthed more of the floor now, scraping layers of dust and ash from what looked less like a foundation and more like a lid, a flat slab with a seam down the middle, almost like a coffin without a name. "It's not an altar," he murmured finally. "It's a door." Annie's arms tightened around Elias. "To where?" "Somewhere older than Elkhorn Ridge. Maybe older than the mountain." Outside, the wind hissed like breath through broken teeth. And when Annie glanced out the window, she saw a second lantern swinging in the trees, too far from the trail for any man to walk in winter. "He's watching again," she said. "I feel it." "It's not him I'm worried about anymore," Samuel replied. "It's what he might be waiting on." He stood and took Elias gently from her arms. The baby didn't cry, didn't blink, just looked up at the man with something almost like recognition. "You knew your name before you knew your mother's voice," Samuel whispered. "What did you see before you saw us?" Annie placed a hand on his arm. I don't want to know the answer to that. But Elias opened his mouth and hummed a low, droning sound that seemed to vibrate the bones in her wrist. Samuel staggered back, nearly dropping him. The symbols on the stone glowed faintly, just for a second, then dimmed. "We need help," Annie said. "We need someone who knows these woods. Someone who's seen what lives past the ridge." Samuel didn't look at her. "There's a man, Black Elk. He was medicine keeper for the Lakota band that used to ride these valleys before the mines opened. Folks say he still lives out beyond the gorge. Will he come?" "No, but maybe he'll let us in." That night they packed what little food they had, wrapped Elias in thick wool, and left the cabin before dawn, snow crunching underfoot like brittle bones. The trail was barely a path, winding narrow through pine and shadow, and by the time the sun rose, both Annie and Samuel were drenched in cold sweat from the climb. They didn't speak. Not when the owl followed them through the trees for half a mile, not when they passed trees with bark peeled upward as though something had crawled out from beneath the roots. Not when Elias started humming again, louder now, clearer. They reached the edge of the gorge by noon, and Samuel cupped his hands to his mouth. "Black Elk, we come in peace. We bring a child that does not belong to this world." There was silence, then a rustle, then a voice from behind a cedar. "All children belong to this world. The question is, which part?" An old man emerged, wrapped in a hide cloak, his eyes sharp and tired all at once. He looked at Annie, then at the baby, and his mouth twitched. "You brought him here?" Annie nodded. "He's mine, but he's not." Black Elk stepped forward slowly, placing a hand on Elias's forehead. His expression changed, hardened. "He remembers too much. That's the danger. Children aren't meant to carry the songs of things that don't die." Samuel gestured behind them. "The cabin. It's built on something." "A seal," Black Elk said. "Long ago we buried what the miners woke, but they built over it, whispered in sleep. Then one of theirs stole something from the seal and ran east with it. We thought it was a trinket, an object, but it was her." He looked at Annie now. "Your mother was the vessel, and now you are. But he nodded at Elias. "He is the echo." Annie felt her knees go weak. "What do we do?" Black Elk turned and pointed to the gorge. "You bring him to the water, where the sun never hits. If he drinks and the stone sings, he was meant to be returned. If not, you take him back and guard the door until the earth forgets his name." They climbed down into the ravine, frost clinging to their hair like ghosts, and reached a pool black as night. Annie knelt, dipped a hand into the water, and let Elias sip from her palm. At first, nothing happened. Then the wind stopped. The trees above stilled, and the water began to hum. Not loud, not angry, but soft, like the lullaby her mother used to sing before everything went wrong. Samuel looked at Black Elk. "What does it mean?" "It means he remembers, but he does not yet belong to the darkness. There's still time." Annie stood, clutching Elias close. "Time for what?" "To choose." The old man looked up toward the ridge. "But hurry, because something else remembers too, and it does not want to be forgotten." They returned to the cabin by dusk, wind howling like a mother keening through the eaves. And Annie felt the baby stir against her chest, as though he too sensed the cold had teeth now. Samuel didn't speak, not when they passed the tree with the carved face, one eye burned out, one weeping sapor when they saw the footprints circling the outhouse that hadn't been there that morning, long, bare, and too many toes. Black Elk hadn't followed them back. He'd simply watched from the gorge's edge and said, "She'll come for the boy now. She always does once the seal stirs." Annie didn't ask who she was. She'd known the answer before he said it. Not a person, not really, but something that remembered being one, that wore a shape stitched from grief and old trees and the sound of children crying in the snow. That night, Samuel took shift sleeping near the door with the rifle across his lap, while Annie pressed Elias close and whispered songs she hadn't sung since Tennessee. The baby didn't cry anymore. That frightened her most. He only listened, wide-eyed, like something was speaking to him in silence. The next morning, Samuel woke to find Annie standing barefoot in the snow, her hair loose, her arms empty. Elias lay in the cradle, untouched, but Annie's eyes were glassy and wet. "I dreamed of my mother," she said, "but she wasn't mine. She had no face, only branches for hands. She held me under the earth and told me the baby was her gift, her replacement." Samuel pulled her back inside, but her skin was cold to the touch, her breath shallow. "She's calling to you," he said. "We need to find the hollow tree." "What tree?" "The one Black Elk warned about, where the first vessel died." They left before noon, this time heading west through the thickets no man cleared, where the snow gathered like whispers and the sky never quite broke through. The path narrowed, twisted, then opened into a clearing ringed by oaks so old they leaned like elders in council, and in the middle stood the hollow tree. Black, hollowed clean to the roots, with bones nailed to its trunk in the shape of a star. Annie stepped forward slowly, her boots cracking twigs. Elias tucked beneath her shawl. She didn't cry, didn't blink, just whispered, "I was born here." Samuel reached for her hand. "No, Annie, that's what she wants you to believe." But the wind answered now, in words, not loud, but certain. "You were buried here, child. I made you whole again." The tree split open, not visibly, but in feeling, in air, and the shape slithered from it, not walking, not crawling, but flowing, like smoke made of sorrow. It formed a woman's face first, pale, eyeless, lips cracked with dried milk, then arms, then nothingness. "Return him to me," it whispered. "He's not yours, he's mine. He carries my voice, he sings my death." Annie backed away, but her feet wouldn't move fast enough. The thing didn't chase, it only hovered, watching. "You dreamt of the cradle, didn't you?" it cooed. "The one you were buried in. The dirt held you so tight, it kissed your lungs dry, but I gave you breath again, and now you bring him to me." "No," Annie whispered. "You stole me. You filled me with songs I never asked to carry. You watched while they burned the women who came before." The spirit hissed. "I gave you safety, in exchange for silence. Then I break the silence," Annie said. "I name you Hollow Wife." The creature recoiled, as though the name itself had power. Samuel raised his rifle and fired into the air. "Back to the seal with you." But it was Elias who truly acted. The baby opened his mouth and screamed not a cry, but a sound deeper than sound, something that shook the frost from trees and cracked the bark like thunder. The Hollow Wife shrieked and vanished into smoke, sucked backward into the tree like a curse reversed. Silence fell, heavy, cold, and the tree stood empty once more. Annie collapsed. Samuel caught her before she hit the snow. Elias lay in her arms, limp but warm, breathing, eyes closed. "We need to end this," Samuel said. "Seal it again, and bury the name so deep no one ever speaks it." They returned to the cabin by nightfall. The stone slab still pulsed faintly. Black Elk was waiting on the porch. "She found you," he said, "but you named her. That's something she can't survive." He reached into his pouch and handed Samuel a small bundle. Inside, teeth, women's teeth, burned and blackened. "The last of the vessels," he said. "Bury them under the door. Let the earth close around them." Samuel did. That night the baby didn't hum. He cried, like a baby should. And Annie wept with him, rocking gently, whispering lullabies of a mother who wasn't made of branches, but of skin and hope and the strength to say no. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and steady, erasing all but the truth they chose to keep. The wind changed direction the next morning, curling through the cracks of the cabin with a scent that didn't belong to the mountains, something sweet and rotted, like wilted blossoms pressed into damp wood. Annie smelled it before her eyes opened, and she knew without knowing how that something had shifted in the soil beneath their feet. Samuel had buried the teeth at dawn, shoveling earth with a solemn precision, his breath fogging in the cold as if each exhale bore a name he didn't dare speak. Annie stood inside the cabin with Elias pressed to her chest, rocking slowly, watching the floorboards beneath the hearth as though waiting for something to stir. "She's not gone," Annie whispered when Samuel stepped in. "The Hollow Wife, she's curled under us. I feel her bones humming." Samuel didn't answer right away. He set down his coat, snow dripping from the sleeves, then walked to the hearth and crouched. "This cabin was built on old land," he said. "Built too quick, too cheap. Miners didn't ask who was buried here." Annie moved toward him, the baby murmuring against her collarbone. "We have to finish it, Samuel. Not just bury what's left, we have to find where it started." Samuel looked up at her. "Then we ripped the floor." They worked in silence, prying up boards with a rusted crowbar in bare hands, dust rising in bursts like breath from a sleeping mouth. The baby cried once, then stilled, wide-eyed again, staring at the dark hole opening beneath them. The pit was deeper than it should have been. Earth dug down and down, slick with old ash and bone. And in the center, half crushed by a crumbled beam, lay a cradle, not made of wood, made of antlers. Curved and wound together like something grown, not built, with hide stretched between the tips and a dark stain at its base that hadn't dried in decades. "She was buried in it," Annie whispered. "The Hollow Wife," before she wore that name. Samuel reached into the hole, brushing aside ash, pulling free a bundle wrapped in hide. Inside, a strip of linen, a small carved doll with no face, and a lock of hair blonde, fine, exactly the shade of Elias's. Annie stared. "It's not mine," she said. "I never cut his hair. I never—" But she trailed off, because memory twisted then, and in her mind flashed a scene she didn't remember living, kneeling in the snow, scissors in her hand, the baby screaming while she snipped, and the trees around her chanting something low and steady. Samuel gripped her shoulders. "She touched you before you came here. She marked him through you. That's why you fled. You knew something followed." Annie shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "I didn't know it then. Only felt wrong. Every time he cried, the wind answered. Every time I sang, the air turned cold. I thought I was going mad." Samuel lifted the cradle out of the pit and smashed it against the hearthstone. It didn't break. The antlers twisted, but did not crack. The hide pulsed once, then hissed. Elias began to wail. "Burn it," Samuel said. "Now." They dragged the cradle outside, doused it in lamp oil, and struck a match. The fire fought them, sputtered, turned green at the edges. Then it roared, and from within it came a scream, thin, high, and not human. The trees shuddered. Birds scattered from frozen branches. Annie fell to her knees. In her arms, Elias arched back, his eyes glowing faintly, pupils blown wide. "She's in him," Annie whispered. "She didn't leave. She's trying to come through him." Samuel pulled the pouch from Black Elk's satchel and poured a circle of salt around them. "She can't pass a boundary of truth," he said. "But we need more than salt. We need to name her final sin." Annie looked up at him, shaking. She was a mother who let her children die. That's what they whispered. She left them in the snow. Said the mountain took them, but they found their bones in the cradle. She fed on their cries. She became their lullaby. Samuel nodded. "Then speak it. Speak it to him. Let her hear." Annie bent over Elias, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "You are not hers. She was never a mother. She was a silence that devoured the womb. Her name is Broken Lullaby. She cannot sing you anymore." Elias stopped crying. The wind died. The fire in the cradle hissed one last time, then turned to ash. The ground stilled. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat by the hearth with Elias between them, listening to the silence. Real silence. Not filled with whispers or memories that weren't theirs. In the morning, the snow began to melt. Not everywhere. Just around the cabin, a ring of thaw. A promise. Annie held Elias close and closed her eyes, finally hearing nothing but his breath and the soft creak of the rocking chair. The snow stopped falling 3 days later, though the clouds never left. They hung low over Elkhorn Ridge like bruises pressed against the sky, heavy with secrets that still hadn't thawed. Inside the cabin, the salt circle had worn thin beneath Annie's pacing feet, but the baby hadn't cried since the fire. He cooed and blinked and watched with those wide, unnatural eyes that sometimes caught the candlelight and held it too long. Samuel slept little. He sat by the window most nights, shotgun on his lap, watching the tree line where branches still trembled without wind. And Annie kept the pouch of Black Elk's medicine near her heart and spoke aloud to the baby, when the silence got too thick. "You're mine," she whispered each morning as she fed him, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched his cheek. Not hers, not theirs, just mine. But something stirred in the ashes left behind the cabin, something that didn't die with the cradle. The morning frost began to shape patterns on the window spirals, spirals within spirals, as if hands had pressed from the other side and spun messages into the ice. Samuel scraped one off with the back of his knife and found it reformed by dusk. "She's not gone," he said grimly. "Only weakened. She's waiting for the wrong word, the wrong gesture, one crack in the truth." Annie said nothing, only tightened her hold on Elias. That night, a knock came on the door. Not the wind, not the groan of timber. A knock, 2 sharp taps, then silence. Samuel rose first, gun raised, stepping to the threshold. But Annie stopped him. "No," she said, her voice clear. "It's for me." She opened the door. Outside stood a woman wrapped in a red shawl, her hair long and black, her eyes like obsidian polished by centuries. Her face held no malice, only sorrow. "The cradle was not hers to burn," the woman said softly. "You stole what belonged to the mountain." Annie stepped out barefoot into the snow. "It fed on children," she answered. "It fed on mothers. It was a lie carved in bone." The woman nodded. "Yes, but some lies become true when buried long enough. Now the land remembers grief. It remembers you." Annie clutched Elias to her chest. "What do you want?" The woman looked down at the child. "To see if he dreams of her, if he still sings her song in his sleep." Annie didn't reply. She didn't move. Samuel stepped beside her then, lowering his gun. "Who are you?" The woman turned to him. "The last one who rocked that cradle. Before it was twisted, before her name was swallowed, I buried my daughter in it. She was a good child. She died before the hollow wife was born. That thing used my grief like tinder." Annie's voice cracked. "Then help us finish it. Help us send her back." The woman held out her hand. In her palm lay a stone carved with a spiral. "Burn this above the ashes, and sing. Not words, just hum. A mother's hum. But it must be true. It must come from love." She placed it in Annie's hand and turned back toward the trees. "And if you lie," she said without turning around, "she'll know. She always knows." Annie stood in the snow long after the woman vanished. That night, she placed the spiral stone on the hearth, lit a fresh flame, and sat with Elias in her lap. She began to hum, a tune without lyrics, a sound older than her fear. It trembled in the walls. It softened the corners of the room. Samuel watched from his chair, nodding slowly, tears in his eyes, though he didn't know why. Outside, the wind shifted again. But this time, it didn't carry rot. It smelled like pine, like river water, like morning. The fire flickered high. The ashes on the ground shifted, then stilled. And deep beneath the floorboards, something sighed. Not in anger, not in longing, but in rest. Annie hummed, until Elias closed his eyes, his breath slow and even. When she finally stopped, the cabin felt still for the first time since she'd arrived. Not empty, not watched, just still. Samuel reached over, took her hand, and whispered, "She's gone." Annie nodded. "She's not hungry anymore." The next morning, they buried the spiral stone in the earth where the cradle had burned. Annie didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The wind was quiet. The baby slept easy. And for the first time since the mountain called her west, there were no footsteps in the snow that didn't belong to them. The thaw came not with sunlight, but with a shift so subtle Annie almost didn't feel it. The cabin's air lightened. The draft beneath the door no longer carried the scent of mildew and iron, and even Elias's cries softened into little murmurs that rose and fell like waves against a distant shore. Samuel moved with less caution, his cane tapping softly as he walked the length of the porch without scanning the tree line every third step. But still, she didn't let herself hope. Not entirely. The memory of that red-shawled woman lingered like the last trace of smoke in the rafters, and sometimes when Annie held Elias close, he'd stop mid-giggle and turn his head sharply, as though hearing something neither of them could see. They didn't burn the salt circle, only let it crumble with time. and even then Annie hesitated to sweep it away, her broom pausing at the faint white line on the floorboards, as if crossing it might open some forgotten gate. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, the snow outside dripping slow from the eaves and the stove crackling steady, that Samuel said it. "We never spoke about who the father is." His voice was low, almost cautious, not like a man accusing, but like one inviting something fragile into the light. Annie didn't flinch. She was sitting with Elias bundled in her arms, rocking him slow, the rhythm automatic. "I told you," she said softly. "He never touched me." Samuel nodded, watching the flames in the stove dance against the iron walls. "And I believe you. But there's something in the way you look at the child. It's not just fear. It's grief." Annie's breath caught, just for a moment. "Because he reminds me of the part of me I couldn't protect," she said. "And because he's the only part I brought with me when I ran." Samuel nodded again, and they let the silence stretch. The wind had turned again, soft and steady, brushing against the windows with no threat. That night, she dreamed of smoke, not fire, but smoke rising from a riverbed, curling through bare trees, and carrying with it the scent of cedar and copper. In the dream, Elias was older, walking just ahead of her, barefoot in the frost but unafraid. And just beyond the bend, a shadow stood, not the hollow wife, not the hunger, but a man. A man with no face, only a silhouette, waiting. When she awoke, the cabin was filled with the scent from her dream cedar and copper and smoke. The stove had gone out. Samuel was gone. Panic surged through her as she grabbed Elias and threw open the door. But there he was, just beyond the porch, standing in the snow. Not Samuel, someone else. A stranger, wrapped in an old army coat, his hands bare despite the cold, his face covered in soot. Annie froze. "Who are you?" she demanded, clutching Elias to her chest. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just lifted one hand and pointed to the child. "No," she whispered. "No, you don't get to come back now. You don't get to ask." The man tilted his head. The wind picked up. Samuel came limping from the woods a moment later, axe in hand, breath heavy. "Who is it?" he called. But when he reached her side and looked where she pointed, there was no one there. Only tracks. 2 sets. One headed toward the ridge, one gone in a circle and vanished into the trees. Annie's hands shook. She couldn't speak. Samuel pulled her inside, set the latch on the door, and built the fire up again. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked. "The one you're running from?" She nodded slowly. "He was never dead, just hiding in something worse." Samuel didn't ask for more. He didn't press her. He just took Elias from her arms, held him close, and said, "Whatever he was, he doesn't get to touch this child again." That night, Annie didn't sleep. She stood by the window long after the stove had dimmed again, her eyes fixed on the edge of the woods. Somewhere out there, the smoke still drifted. Somewhere, something remembered, but so did she. And this time, she wouldn't run. Not from ghosts, not from guilt, not even from the man whose shadow still reached for her across the snow. They buried the truth before the thaw came. Samuel didn't say the words aloud, but Annie knew it when she watched him stand beside the fire pit he'd dug behind the cabin, its edges blackened, the dirt half frozen and smelling of iron. In his hands were the remains of the coat the stranger had worn, now charred through, the buttons melted, the fabric scorched to brittle fragments. There was no body, just ashes. Ashes and a rusted locket that had landed in the snow after the blaze had burned itself out. Annie hadn't asked him to do it. She hadn't even seen the moment it happened. She had only heard the roar, the night before, when Samuel had gone out alone after seeing the footprints reappear near the edge of the tree line, circling the cabin like a predator who'd grown tired of waiting. Elias had cried all night. She'd wrapped him against her chest and sung lullabies in a voice that trembled with something deeper than fear, a mourning, a memory. When Samuel came in, smelling of smoke and ash, he hadn't spoken a word, just laid the locket on the table beside her and sat down with his back to the door. She recognized it immediately. The same locket she had thrown into the river 2 years ago, the night her real husband had struck her down for the last time. Inside was a photograph, half-burnt, of a younger Annie holding a bouquet, her smile brittle and trained, the man beside her already casting his long, possessive shadow. She'd seen him again and again in her dreams, and then in the flesh hollowed out and hateful, chasing her through the snow not with fists but with something darker, something born of vengeance and hunger and the need to destroy what had once escaped him. Now there was only this, a patch of scorched earth, a locket, and a silence that didn't feel as heavy anymore. That morning, the sun rose clearer than it had all winter. The clouds didn't smother it. The wind didn't steal its warmth. And when Annie stepped onto the porch, Elias cradled against her chest, she could hear bird song from down the valley. It was as if the land itself was waking again. Samuel brought out a small chair and joined her. He said nothing, only passed her a cup of boiled spruce tea, the steam curling between them like threads not yet broken. Annie looked at him, at the man who had once been a shadow in his own house, broken in body but quietly whole in soul, who had protected her without asking questions, without demanding explanations. He wasn't the father, she said softly, watching Elias's small hand grasp the edge of her shawl. But he wanted to be, or wanted to claim it, just to keep hold of me. I was a thing to him, not a person. When I told him I was with child, he said I was lying, that no cripple could leave a woman untouched, and she still come up with a baby. So I ran. Samuel nodded once. I never thought he was the father. Annie smiled faintly. How? Because Elias doesn't flinch when I raise my hand near him. Because he doesn't cry in his sleep like children do when they've been touched by cruelty. He looks at you like the world begins and ends with your heartbeat. And I've known enough broken men to know the look of damage when I see it. She leaned into the quiet of his words, feeling them settle deep in the parts of her still mending. Thank you, she whispered. He didn't respond, just reached out, gently, and ran his fingers over Elias's cheek with the kind of reverence that felt like an answer. That afternoon, they began clearing out the storage shed together, breaking apart old crates and repairing the roof with what supplies remained. The snow had melted down to a manageable crust, and the mud beneath it smelled like new life. It wasn't until evening that Annie saw them at the edge of the woods, just beyond where the salt circle had once been. 3 figures, old, wrapped in deer hides and bone necklaces, their faces painted in ash and ochre, the hollow wives, watching, but not coming closer, not threatening, just watching. Annie didn't feel fear, only a deep, solemn understanding. She stepped down from the porch, walked until she stood just beyond the char line, Elias against her chest, his breath warm on her skin. She bowed her head once, not in submission, but in respect. He's gone, she said. You can go now, too. The wind stirred their cloaks, lifted the ashes at her feet into a spiral. One of them raised her hand, gnarled, skeletal, but not unkind. Then they vanished, like smoke, like memory. Annie turned back toward the cabin, where Samuel waited in the door, and as she crossed the threshold, she felt it fully for the first time, the absence of dread, the quiet settling of something sacred. Safety, forgiveness, a beginning where once there had only been running. This time she wouldn't run. This time she would stay. The thaw came slowly, like a reluctant apology. Each day the wind softened, losing its teeth, and patches of bare earth began to show beneath the trees, as though the land itself was remembering how to breathe. The cabin, once wrapped in silence and frost, echoed now with new sounds, Samuel's boots dragging against the porch, Elias's curious coos as he reached for the world with small, sticky hands, and Annie's voice, reading aloud from one of the tattered books she'd found beneath the floorboards. It should have been peaceful. It should have felt like healing. But something tugged at her in the hours just before dawn, a whisper in the back of her mind that had not stilled since the hollow wives vanished into the trees. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something older. A knowing that not all hauntings leave footprints. One morning, as Samuel carved new slats for the barn door, Annie took Elias down the hill, wrapped tightly in a quilt she'd sewn herself. red thread crossing over old blue patches like veins over healing skin. The trail was muddy but walkable, and she welcomed the ache in her thighs, the burn in her calves, as if proving her own strength to the earth that had tried to bury her. By the time she reached the creek, she could hear it rushing fast, too fast for spring, like the melt-off was chasing something. Elias stirred in her arms, whimpering softly, and she quieted him with a hum, rocking gently as she stared into the water. That's when she saw it. Just beyond the edge of the bank, lodged against a cluster of rocks, was a boot, worn, leather peeled back like blistered skin, and still inside-eat a bone, small, shaped like a toe. Annie took a step back, her breath catching, not because of the boot, but because she remembered it. The same kind her husband had worn when he'd come after her, years ago. She knew it because she'd stitched it herself, back when he still demanded her servitude and her silence. She would have run then, but Elias had been inside her. And she had thought for just a little while that love might still be possible if she endured long enough. The memory gripped her like cold fingers around her throat, but she shook it off. This was different. This was evidence, a fragment of truth, and if the land was giving it back, then maybe it was time to do more than survive. She wrapped the boot in a burlap sack, tucked it beneath her coat, and headed back up the trail, eyes scanning the trees. At the cabin, Samuel looked up as she approached. "You're pale," he said, rising slowly. "What happened?" She handed him the sack without speaking. He opened it, eyes narrowing. "It's his," she whispered. "From before." Samuel didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded, then walked to the fire pit out back, tossing it in without ceremony. "The mountain's still giving up what it kept," he said. That night, she couldn't sleep. The baby was quiet, the cabin warm, Samuel dozing in the chair with his cane resting beside him. But Annie sat awake, staring at the door, heart drumming with a rhythm she couldn't quiet. Then she heard it, a soft knock, not pounding, not threatening, just persistent. She rose slowly, lifting the rifle from beside the hearth, and inched toward the door. "Who's there?" she called. Silence. Then a whisper. "Annie." Her blood turned to ice. It was a woman's voice, but not one she recognized. "Annie, you left us," it said again, this time closer. She swung the door open. No one was there. Just snow, melting into puddles, and the faintest print of bare feet leading down the path she didn't follow. Not that night. But the next morning, she returned to the fire pit and found something new beside the ashes. A necklace, beaded, woven with dyed horsehair, blue and white, the same kind the Hollow wives wore. It pulsed in her palm like a heartbeat. That afternoon, she gathered her things. Not to leave, to hike. To the place she had never dared go, the ridge above the cabin, where the trees grew too close and the sun barely reached. Samuel offered to come, but she shook her head. "This is mine," she said. "Something I have to face." He didn't argue, only pressed Elias to her chest, kissed the baby's forehead, and said, "Come back whole." The climb was harder than she'd expected. Snow still clung in shaded hollows, and the cold nipped through her gloves, but she didn't stop. Not until she reached the tree line, where the pines twisted and arched over an old burial cider rock stacked in a circle, bones bleached white, and, in the center, a single wooden doll. It was carved like a woman, rough, primitive, but familiar. Annie placed the necklace around its neck. "I didn't forget you," she whispered. "You were the ones who helped me leave, who kept him away long enough for me to run." The wind rustled the branches. She turned to leave, and in the snow beside her own prints were 3 others. The 3 sets of prints didn't melt like the others did. They held their shape as if the snow itself honored the memory of what had walked there, sinking no deeper than an inch, delicate and even, as if the ones who left them had never truly pressed into the earth. Annie stood frozen, staring at them while the wind curled through the trees like a voice too tired to speak clearly. Something old moved beneath her skin, not quite fear, not quite grief, but a tremor of reckoning. The burial site was still, the wooden doll unmoved, the necklace she'd left there now draped across its chest like armor. She wanted to turn back, her legs itched to run. But a part of her, the part that had carried Elias through 2 states, across jagged rivers and frozen plains, knew she couldn't go back to the cabin without knowing what waited just beyond the next ridge. So she followed the prints. They led uphill at first, winding through fallen branches and brittle undergrowth, then dipped low into a hollow where the trees grew stunted and the air took on the cold breath of something buried. The tracks ended near a stone outcropping, half covered in moss and snow, and there, tucked beneath it like a secret folded in prayer, was a leather-bound book. It wasn't hers. It wasn't Samuel's. The pages were yellowed, the edges warped, but the cover bore a single letter burned into the high day. She picked it up, heart-pounding, and flipped it open. The handwriting was familiar, her own, but she had never written this. Page after page, she saw scenes from her past the cellar, where she had hidden the first time he raised his fist, the alley behind the church, where she had whispered to God to make it stop, the train station where she'd clutched a satchel of bread and prayed no one would recognize her. These weren't just memories. They were confessions, feelings she had never spoken aloud, cries she had buried. She dropped the book, breath short, and took a shaky step back. That's when she heard it. The cry, not Elias's, not human. A sound like wind being ripped apart, like sorrow breaking through bark. She spun around, rifle raised, but the trees were empty. Still, the cry echoed, circling her, and she realized it wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from all of them, from the roots, from the branches, from the book itself. She ran. Not blindly, not out of panic, but with purpose, legs slicing through snow, heart pounding in rhythm with a truth she hadn't fully named yet. When she reached the cabin, Samuel met her at the door. He took one look at her face and opened his arms. She collapsed into them, the book still clenched in her fist. "What happened?" he asked, leading her inside. "I found something," she whispered. "Someone's writing down my past." He didn't question. He simply stoked the fire and sat with her until her breathing slowed. That night, as Elias slept curled against her chest, Annie reopened the book. This time, the last page had changed. There was fresh ink, just one line. "Tell him the truth. The forest remembers what you forget." She stared at it until the fire turned to embers. In the morning, she stepped outside and found the tracks gone, melted, swallowed, but in their place was something Elsie's scarf, blue, worn, the one she had wrapped around her younger sister before they were separated at the train station. Annie sank to her knees, fingers trembling as she lifted it. Her sister had been 12, soft-voiced, wide-eyed, left behind, and Annie had never forgiven herself. Samuel came outside, cane sinking into thawed mud. "Is that?" he began, but stopped. She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "She's out there," Annie whispered. "Or someone who knows where she went." Samuel stepped closer. "Then we find her." The sun hung low as they prepared. Annie strapped Elias to her back, layered wool over his chest. Samuel packed food, loaded the rifle, tied a red ribbon to the door to mark the return. And as they started down the ridge hand in hand, eyes wide open, the wind whispered once more, this time not with fear, but with welcome. They followed the mountain's curve where the frost clung stubborn to every pine needle, Samuel's cane leaving clean dents in the packed white as Annie carried Elias close and watched for any flicker in the tree line. The scarf remained in her coat pocket, its faded blue clinging to her fingers like memory made real. And though Samuel said little, every glance he gave her was steady with promise. As they climbed, the forest deepened, growing darker though the sky was clear, as if the trees themselves had thickened in silence, mourning or waiting. At a bend in the trail, Annie paused, heart-seizing. A symbol had been carved into the bark of a twisted asha triangle pierced by a horizontal slash. She knew it. Not from words or books, but from dreams she used to wake from shaking, soaked in sweat. It was the sign her mother used to draw in the dirt whenever thunder cracked too close. The mark that meant, hush. That meant, they are near. Samuel touched her elbow, his voice low. Keep going? She nodded, though her breath came shallow. The wind had stopped. No rustle, no birds. just the hush of snowfall on wool. Then, faint but certain, she heard its smoke crackling. The scent hit her next pine sap and dried sage, and when they rounded the next boulder they saw it, a hut. Low, built from stone and earth, hidden so well it looked like part of the hill itself. A curl of smoke drifted from a crooked pipe, and hanging on the door was a wooden medallion carved with the same triangle and slash symbol. Elias stirred, his tiny hand pressed against her chest. She stepped forward. Samuel didn't stop her. The door opened before she could knock. The woman was old, older than the trees, it seemed. Her braids were silver and wound like rope, her eyes black as wet coal, deep set and watching. She said no greeting, just stepped aside. Annie entered. The heat wrapped her at once. Sage and cedar burned low in a clay basin. Skins lined the walls. At the center sat a bowl filled with water, and beside it a red ribbon like the one tied to their cabin. "You came late," the woman said. "But you came." Annie's voice cracked. "Did you leave this?" She pulled the scarf from her coat. The woman nodded. "Not mine. Hers. My sister?" The old woman knelt. "She passed here, long ago, with the same eyes, but no child, only a hunger. She asked questions the snow didn't answer. Is she alive?" Annie's voice rose. "Please, do you know?" The woman stood slowly. "Alive, yes, but walking the wrong ridge. What you seek lies where." Her voice broke. Annie blinked. "I don't understand." The woman turned to Samuel. "He can't go further. He carries iron in his bones. It offends the watchers." Samuel's grip on his cane tightened. "I don't care what offends them. I won't let her go alone." The woman stepped closer, her gaze fierce. "Then you'll bring ruin on all three." Annie touched Samuel's arm. "Let me, just for this part. If there's truth to be found, I need to hear it first." His jaw flexed. "You sure?" "Yes," she whispered. "It's my story too." He exhaled and stepped back. The woman handed Annie a bundly string of beads, a cracked mirror, and a feather-stained red. "Go north," she said, "where the snow never thaws. Light the fire when you reach the circle. If she still listens, she'll come." Annie took the bundle and kissed Elias's brow. "Stay with Samuel. I'll come back." She stepped into the cold, and the door closed behind her like a final chapter. The forest changed. The path twisted, unfamiliar. Trees leaned inward. The silence thickened, but she followed instinct, followed breath and ache and blood. When she found the circle, it was stone-ringed and hollowed, as if the earth had made a bowl to hold forgotten names. She placed the bundle at the center, took the mirror, and angled it toward the setting sun. Fire sparked. The flame rose high. Then came the voice, fragile, younger than hers. "Annie?" Her breath hitched. "Leah." From the shadows came a girl, older now, hair longer, face thinner, but the eyes were hers. "I thought I imagined you," Leah said, tears starting. "I waited so long." Annie reached forward. "I came. I'm here." They collapsed into each other, sobbing, holding the years between them like pages finally turned. Leah whispered, "Why didn't you write?" "I was afraid," Annie breathed. "Afraid of what he'd do if I told you." "He's gone," Leah said. "I watched him fall." Annie pulled back. "The fire. The night you disappeared, was that you?" Leah nodded. "He locked me in the barn. I broke the lantern to escape." Annie swallowed the lump rising. "The child Eliashi's mine, but not his, I swear." Leah nodded. "I knew. I saw it in your letters." "You read them?" "Every one, before they were burned." They sat together in the snow until the fire died down, and when they stood, they held hands, as if afraid the world would part them again. They returned to the hut in silence. Samuel stood waiting, Elias in his arms, and when he saw the two of them together, his face softened. Annie said only one word, "Sister," and for the first time, he smiled without pain. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story touched you, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us feel a little closer across the miles. Every story finds its home in the hearts of those who need it, and sometimes that's all it takes. If you'd like to hear more stories that lift the spirit and remind us of the quiet miracles around us, feel free to subscribe. We're building something meaningful here, and it means so much to have you along the way. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us.